Tom, we've finally almost reached a culmination of the last couple of months. We've really dedicated the last 2 months. We started the very beginning of December of 2020. It's now February of 2021.
Right.
And we have been talking about the 6 precepts of the Declaration of Independence and the 4 virtues of good citizens, of virtuous citizens. And we've spent the last 3 sessions talking about being self-restraint and self-assertion, civic knowledge. We had a very in-depth conversation about the different buckets of types of economics last month, or
different
types of knowledge.
Different types of rights. Yeah.
Sorry, different types of rights. And now we're on the last and perhaps many would argue the most important of the virtues, self-reliance.
Yeah, boy, it's important. To be free, one needs to be independent. You know, it's funny, we think of that famous document, the Declaration of Independence. And I don't know if people ever pause to think about the individual words, right? A declaration, they're declaring, announcing. And when they do that, they're not even sure if they're gonna get to the place they want. They want to be independent. They're declaring they're independent, but of course there's a big army and navy that disagrees with them. And what are they declaring? They're declaring their independence as a nation, as a regime. They are independent. They're not dependent upon the British regime or any other regime. And just as a nation can be independent, individuals can be. I think of it as a spectrum. It's not an either or. It's a spectrum. At one end is total dependency. Small children are totally dependent. They can't do anything on their own.
Right.
And at the other extreme would be complete independence. What's that? What's that wonderful? Oh, we were talking about Western movies before. Johnson. He goes exploring up in the mountains. He's got grows a big beard. He fights grizzly bears. This is an old Western. It's going to kill me. I can't remember the name of it.
It's going to come to you later.
I should
know this too, but I can't place
Robert Redford. Oh, and it's wonderful. And he goes and he heads out into the West. It's supposed to take place like after the Civil War, and he's entirely on his own in the Rocky Mountains, in the Colorado Rocky Mountains, before there's civilization here.
For any of our members listening, if you know the movie, so everybody else does, go into the comment section and let Tom know.
This is driving me. I can't remember. I've seen this movie several times. It's wonderful. But the point is, there's complete independence. Like, he is literally on his own, finding his own food, figuring out, what he's going to do for shelter at night and things like this. And so there's a spectrum along the way. And
I mean, the more modern example of what you're talking about is Castaway with Tom Hanks.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Right? He gets stranded on an island.
Yes.
You have just a couple things that have fallen out of the airplane, and you're on your own. You've got to figure out how to make it last.
Yes.
And interestingly, he goes through that whole process during the early to mid part of that movie about thinking about committing suicide, even to the point of considering it and trying it. And there's all of these psychological thoughts that we could place towards that. The idea that he can no longer be productive for anybody but himself. If he figured out how to produce something on that island, there's nobody to buy it. There's nobody to trade with. There's nobody to talk to. It's not even just he's alone and he's stranded. He is completely independent from any help.
Yep, that's exactly right. Well, maybe we're turning into movie critics here, Dave. Okay. Maybe we should start doing some
coming soon to a theater near you.
We might need to add some movie critics, critic specials to our lineup. That movie also demonstrates what you and I have talked about before, the fundamental choice every human being faces. Every human being. There's no escaping this. Life or death. It really boils down to that. You want to die? If you want to die, do nothing. Do nothing at all. Just sit there motionless and do nothing. It may not be the most comfortable way to die, but you will die eventually, probably of dehydration or something like that. But if you want to live, this is the challenge. If you say, no, I don't want to die, I want to live, okay, then that means you got to get off your butt and you're going to have to you're going to have to work. Life is work. Life is productivity. Life means using your mind, using your hands. Because we need things. We need food. We need shelter. We need friendships. We need all kinds of things. And that requires some effort, some work.
There's some responsibility in living.
That's right.
You don't just get to sit on the couch and watch Netflix and
that's right.
And know that everything's going to just be handed to you and taken care of.
That's in an age of progressivism and entitlements, that might be one of the most important lessons citizens of the United States today can learn, that if they make that choice for life, they say, I want to live. I don't want to die. I want to live. Well, choosing life, nobody's going to come along and say, here's everything you're going to need. Here's all your medicine. Here's all your food. Here's your shelter. Here's your entertainment. Here's your group of friends right here. That's not the way that it works. If you say, I want to live, okay, then get up and go do something, because life requires effort. Life requires work. It is productivity. And the more productive you are, the more independent you can be, the more self-reliant you can be. And this is one of the key virtues of being a good citizen, because citizens who are dependent on others or dependent on the government, they're not in a good position to keep their own government in check, in line, within the constraints of the Constitution. We've talked at some length about the importance of making sure that government does its proper purpose, its proper job, secure citizens in their freedom, their property. It is supposed to do that. We're not anarchists. We're saying there's a really important role for government to make sure people are secure in their liberty and their property. And that's it. Otherwise, government's supposed to stay out of our lives, stay out of our way, because government can very quickly become too controlling, too powerful, too regulating, and become tyrannical.
Well, and I think that the key point, the key question to what you just said is not that government should, but why should government protect property? And we've talked about this several times before, but to reiterate, government needs to protect private property and stay out of the rest so that people can be productive, so that we can innovate, so we can create new things, so we can improve on existing things, so that we can employ people, so that other people can have jobs, so that other people can be productive too. As soon as we are insecure or not secure in our person and property, the incentive or the reality of going and being productive is diminished. Right? Once you have no security in, well, if I come up with an idea, somebody's going to steal it and nobody's going to do anything about it, I go into defense mode all the time. I stop thinking about how do I work on something productive, and I focus strictly on how do I keep myself safe.
Yeah, you're not going to be real inventive, right? You're not going to be inventing all kinds of new things if somebody's going to come and steal it from you as soon as you get it working. And I want to put everything you said is absolutely true, and I want to add to it a civic context, what that means, not just as individual human beings, but as citizens. As citizens, we want to be able to look at those in government and say, I kind of want to use a derogatory term. So you bozos, you better do the jobs we told you should do.
Sure.
You know, the national government, that means mainly matters of national security, national defense. It's a dangerous world out there, and there are foreign regimes and with military power that want to hurt us. So you make sure that we're safe from that. And otherwise, stay out of our lives, stay within the little constitutional box that we created for you. We want to be able to say that, but it's hard to tell those in government to stay within the limits of the Constitution if we're dependent on those in government, right? If we're on our knees with our hands out like this, saying, please give me some stuff. Give me some free food and some free education and free health care. Please. That transfers all the power to them.
Right.
They now become the lords and masters over our lives. So living as free citizens requires a government of limited constitutional power, and for that government to stay limited and stay constitutional requires citizens who are largely self-reliant and independent. And here's the beauty. Throughout most of human history, it was a real challenge. It was a real struggle to be self-reliant, to be financially independent, precisely for the reason you were talking about. Most people weren't very secure. It's interesting. I spent many years assembling data, and then I found there's an economist who's no longer with us. His last name is Madison with 2 Ds, I believe, Maddison. And some of his students have created a website with the data he collected. What he was interested in was the total global amount of wealth over time. Going back as far as he could try to, when you get into ancient history, I mean, you're kind of summarizing and generalizing because there's no accurate accounting of these things. But the point is, what his databases show is for hundreds of years, thousands of years, the total global amount of wealth is this flat, low line. There's very little wealth in the world. What's there is controlled by a handful of tyrants, pharaohs, Caesars, kings. The vast majority of human beings lived in terrible poverty, didn't have hardly anything, and there just wasn't much wealth. And it didn't change because basically the way to get wealthy in the ancient world was conquest. There was, one king had a bunch of stolen jewels and right things like that in the palace, and so you waged war, and you went and invaded his palace and stole it from him, and now you have it until someone steals it from you.
Well, there was no wealth creation.
Right.
There was no mechanism to create wealth. I mean, in those times, there wasn't even a redistribution of wealth. It wasn't like, here's the set pie and somebody's going to decide where it all goes. There was a set pie and it all went to the ruler.
Well, internationally, there kind of was a redistribution by war. I mean, there wasn't some.
True.
I mean, that's how, right? That if one regime had a lot of riches and you were real poor, the way you got those riches is you went to war.
And so think about what that means for education systems, for childhoods, what you are trained to do as a child in a regime that is focused on the only way we can gain more wealth is through war and through conquest. Children become trained in battle. Yeah. Children don't get trained in theories. They don't get trained in classical ideas. They don't get trained in everything from Socrates to Shakespeare to mathematics and Latin and all of these things. They get trained in...
They don't get trained in wokeness.
Oh, well, that's... You just gave a reason to go back to that. I don't necessarily want to do that.
But maybe military training is better, yeah.
But yeah, well, I'm going to adjust that in a second. But we never teach kids. At that time, we didn't teach kids the fundamentals they needed to be able to go off and do something productive, to invent, to create, to design. And truthfully, a lot of those, the people who were naturally great thinkers were ostracized. Right. They were ostracized for going and wanting to think things through and understand the heavens and the earth and the stars. They wanted to understand mathematics. They wanted to understand all these things. And they were ostracized for not being a great warrior.
Yeah. In fact, I want to give a concrete, real-life example of what you're talking about. Sparta.
Right.
Ancient Sparta was this. And for those who are interested in this, there's a tremendous scholar who's actually a good friend of mine, Paul Ray, R-A-H-E is how he spells his last name. I taught with him at Hillsdale College. And Paul, well, he's best known for he produced this gigantic 3-volume, what was the title? Republics, Ancient and Modern. And volume 1 is on the ancient republics of Sparta and Athens. And since then, he's come out with several other books. He really is one of the great authorities on ancient Sparta. And what you learn reading his scholarship, for the Spartans in that ancient classical setting where people are not creating wealth, they're just stealing it from each other. In that sense, the pie really was fixed. There's just a limited amount of wealth, and the only question is who's going to have it, and it was a zero-sum game. If one city, if one regime had a lot, then everyone else had little. So the Spartans, as a people, they said the highest human good is victory in battle.
Right.
Because if you don't have victory in battle, nothing else matters. You can't get any of the things that you want and need in life. So the entire Spartan regime was a military camp, a military training facility. Children, boys, for example, were allowed, and I'm using that word very specifically, the government of Sparta allowed newborn boys to stay at home with their mothers only until I think it was age 6 or 7.
Right.
And once they hit that age, off to military school. They were gone. Every boy in the city, you're gone. And they would spend the rest of their life in the Army. They realized we do need babies. We got to have babies. All the young men are in the military together. They're not going to be having babies. So they would have these very elaborate, detailed, what's the word I want to use? These ceremonies so that the young men would come back and they would marry and they would impregnate the young women. And even then, the young men went right back to military training. It was just a kind of a necessity. We need babies to keep the city going.
Yep.
And so this is what life looked like when everything revolves around war, and everything revolves around war because nobody's creative, nobody's productive, nobody's creating wealth. The only way to get the good things you want is to go wage war against your neighbors.
So let me pose a question to you. You mentioned a minute ago, you mentioned they weren't teaching wokeness.
Yeah.
And it was a joke and it was funny, but there's a lot of truth to that because at the same time, this transition, I'm going to actually use the word evolution of our education system to wokeness, was to fight a war. This was the progressives saying, we're going to fight a war against traditional
That's right.
free market American ideas.
Yeah, constitutional government.
Constitutional government.
Virtuous citizenship.
All of the things that we are trying to preserve in the Vino Veritas Society.
That's right.
The transition from a classical education to a woke-based education where you are learning more about, as you said in your article this week in Newsweek, the virtues of knowing thyself rather than being actually virtuous.
Right.
They did that because they're creating that war on the classical idea of education. And you do that by changing what people are being taught.
Let me put a little bit of an edge on that. Classical education teaches people how to be self-reliant, how to be independent, how to be productive, how to be creative, how to make things, build things, do things, understand things. Woke education teaches people to be victims. And then as people come to think of themselves as being victims, woke education it coaches people how to demand more entitlements. Right. If you're a victim, someone's done something bad to you, therefore somebody owes you something. And now the conversation is, what is owed to you and who's going to give it, who's going to pay it? And that's a whole lot of what goes on in modern universities today.
There's one other element that we've talked a whole lot about that is included in that. And classical education is the pursuit of truth, is the pursuit of understanding truth. And I'm going to redefine it just because we have to keep going back on this. Truth is something that exists whether somebody knows it or not.
Yes.
Whether somebody has realized it or not, has discovered it or not, truth always exists.
Yes.
And they have changed it from there's no longer a pursuit of truth, there's a pursuit of belief. There's a pursuit of opinion. There's a pursuit of my truth rather than the truth. And the pursuit of my truth causes the conflict. It's the root of the conflict.
I would add to that, modern education, woke education has very little to do with truth and very much to do with advocacy for an agenda, for a cause, part of a political cause, a political agenda. Let's advocate for that. There are a lot of students who in school right now, in universities, we could drive up to the University of Colorado at Boulder this morning, and we would find many students who think the purpose of being in a university is to advocate for their cause, their agenda, which usually is some watered-down, confused version of progressivism or central planning or something like that.
That makes them feel better.
That's right, absolutely. And so it's a very different understanding of education, and the result is very different. You know, going back to, I was talking about that line. If you imagine a chart here, a graph,
right?
You're going through centuries and then millennia, thousands of years. The total global amount of wealth doesn't change much. There are little tiny bumps and dips, but basically a flat line, and it's low until you get to the middle of the 18th century. Right around the time of the American founding, this amazing thing happens for the global total, all the wealth in the world. It goes like this.
Yeah.
It's the famous hockey stick curve, right? It goes almost straight up. And I remember bumping into this data the first time myself and thinking, Eureka, what in the world happened in the 1750s to the 1850s? Did human nature all of a sudden radically change? Were human beings better, smarter?
Right.
And the answer is no. Human nature didn't change. They were exactly the same as human beings have always been. What changed was a change in incentives. People went from living under what I like to call in the ancient world, most people lived under the slave incentive. They worked because they were forced to work. Mm-hmm. Soldiers employed by the pharaoh or the emperor or, whatever thug was running the government, whatever title he gave himself, somebody was holding a whip or a chain and say, you're going to work or I'll hurt you. Mm-hmm. And under that kind of incentive, we know precisely how much work a slave is going to do. The bare minimum to avoid being beaten. Mm-hmm. He's not going to do any more work. I mean, why would he? He's not going to invent new ways, new technologies to be more efficient. It's all just going to get taken from him. So he's going to do the bare minimum that the soldier says you have to pick, so many bushels of wheat or cotton or whatever it is, or you're going to be punished. What happens when that wealth curve goes up is for the first time in some parts of the world, not everywhere, but in the United States, to some degree in some Western European countries, laws started to protect property, private property, rather than governments taking private property. And as people started to feel relatively safe and secure in their property, they realized, hey, if I'm productive, if I'm inventive, if I do create a way to be more efficient and I can harvest more of my crop or create a new technology that other people want and value, I get to keep what I produce. I get to keep whatever I trade, whatever I earn. And so we see this explosion in creativity, invention, innovation. I mean, there's a reason the Industrial Revolution doesn't happen until the 1800s. The reason it didn't happen in the 1600s or the 1200s was because property wasn't protected back then. Who's going to go invest millions of dollars in building a gigantic factory, right? And experimenting and coming up with new technologies to produce things on a mass scale if it's all going to get taken away from you? You have to first have protection of property rights, and then you get things like the Industrial Revolution and this great explosion in wealth creation.
And when citizens are not entitled to those rights, are not entitled to protection of their private property, the pharaoh, the Caesar, the dictator, the emperor, whatever it is, they don't really have a whole lot of incentive in making things easier either, right? What's the value in if I'm pharaoh in old Egypt? Mm-hmm. What's my incentive in going and building a machine that can stack rocks to build a pyramid when I have slaves who can go do it? Right? So as long as there's no security people don't have not only security in their own private property, that property is including their own persons, their own ideas, their own mind, their own body. And until that happened, even the emperors and the dictators and the pharaohs had no incentive to go invest in anything either.
In fact, it's funny, a number of people made this observation. John Locke made a similar observation, and others have. In the modern world, where property rights are protected and people are creative and productive and inventive, even ordinary people, in fact, even the poorest people live better. They have better quality of lives than the greatest pharaohs and Caesars and kings in the ancient world. Precisely because of what you're talking about. There was no invention. There was no innovation. A poor person in the United States today, a really poor person, has access to better quality food, better medicines, better medical technology than the Pharaoh of Egypt had 3,000 years ago.
Well, think about why that makes sense, too. I mean, these people in power, right? Before we had this idea that all men are created equal, we had people in power who were, to the perception of the whole, they were perceived as better. They were perceived as higher level. But it didn't mean that they were smarter. It didn't mean that they were
Right.
skilled in physics or skilled in mathematics or skilled in biology or chemistry or any of these things. And it didn't necessarily mean that they cared a whole lot about their education, because they were being handed a dynasty.
Usually what it meant, the ruling class, usually it meant nothing more than they were more willing to be brutal and cruel than others were.
Sure.
That's how they got to that position.
But my point that I was trying to get to is they're being handed this at first, right? I mean, usually it's your father died, it's passed on to the next son, especially with kings within that hierarchy. And there was no attempt to say, man, I want to go learn about chemistry, or I want to go learn about physics and engineering so that I can start building indoor plumbing, because I think that would be a great thing for me to have. The pharaohs and the dictators and the kings, that they weren't thinking about how do I make my life better. They were thinking about how do I continue to be as brutal as possible to that group of people so that I don't lose my power. They were in effect acting as in defense of their own property. The same way we talk about sort of that far end of being independent.
Yeah, how do they maintain their power?
Right.
And so let's be very clear here. There was some innovation in the ancient world. It tended to be very slow, but there was some. The Romans at some point figured out how to build aqueducts and get fresh water into homes and carry away human waste, which was a great innovation.
Sure.
But innovation and invention in the ancient world happened despite tremendous government control. Government power basically stifled most innovation or much innovation. Right. That's why there was very little of it. In the modern world, where you have pockets of freedom and property rights and security and individual liberty actually incentivizes innovation and invention and creativity. It happens precisely because of people are more secure in their property. And that leads us to this basic concept that's at the core of this idea of being self-reliant, independent and self-reliant, which is wealth creation. It seems, especially to entrepreneurs, this seems so commonsensical that a lot of entrepreneurs think this is a boring topic. It's not even worth talking about.
Right.
And yet it's a revolutionary topic. And it's one of the most hopeful, inspiring ideas ever discovered by the human mind. Wealth does not just exist out there in the world. Wealth can be created. Wealth must be created. And we should probably clarify here what we mean by wealth, because when we within the Vino Veritas Society, when we talk about wealth, we're not necessarily talking about money, right? Money is a medium of exchange, and you can use anything for currency, for money. You can print green dollar bills if you want to, but lots of other regimes have used everything from seashells to gold and other things as currency to trade. Wealth is something different. Wealth is having something that others value. If you have something, and it doesn't have to be a physical thing. It could be. You could have a nice house or a car or a computer that others value and they're willing to pay a lot of money for it. But it can also be a talent. You could have a skill. You could have some knowledge. You could know some things that other people value. As you increase what you have that others value, you're increasing your wealth.
Right.
And so there are a couple of key factors to wealth creation, which is the path towards being self-reliant. Perhaps the first and most important is stop thinking about yourself. If you want to create wealth, it doesn't really matter what you're interested in or what you value. Here, I always like to challenge in colleges and universities, there's this tremendous emphasis, actually even at the high school level, tremendous emphasis on follow your passion.
Right.
Do what you want to do. Well, if you want to create wealth, I would suggest the opposite. Don't follow your passions. Pay attention to other people and see what is it they want. What do they need? What do they value? And then think about your own skills and abilities. What can you do to provide or produce or deliver things that other people value? The more that you create that others value, the more wealth you're creating for yourself. It also means however much wealth you're born with, if you're born into a very poor family, In a regime of freedom, where you're protected in your property rights, you don't have to stay poor. The law does not command that you stay poor. If you want to be entrepreneurial, if you're willing to take the risk and do the work and look at what other people need and make the effort to try to supply it, you can create wealth for yourself. You can, in a free regime, in a truly free regime, you can be born poor and you can die very wealthy. You can make a very nice life for your family and the people you care about.
Well, and let's also emphasize that goes the other way too. You can be born very rich.
Yes.
And be very selfish and not pay attention to what other people need.
Yes.
And spend money on things that aren't necessary and spend your wealth and invest your time and your talents into things that other people aren't interested in. And those could be physical or talent based and lose everything.
And that happens.
And that happens all the time.
All the time.
And it happens to all types of people, right? So some of this is about making good decisions.
Yeah.
And understanding that just because something is worth something to you doesn't mean it's worth something to somebody else. And
That's right.
And I grew up always hearing something is only worth what somebody else is willing to pay for it.
Right.
Right? If I have this beer stein and I say, look at this, it's got the American flag on it and the eagle on it. This thing is awesome. And I have a great personal story behind it. And I want you to value it because of my personal story. Right? I bought this when I was on a trip to Germany and it was right after 9/11. I have all these stories about it. And somebody's going to look at me and say, it's a beer stein. I'll give you $2 for it.
Right.
Right? And because it might be worth $100 to me.
Right.
Then we don't make a trade. And that's the foundation of a free market.
Economic value, right? Meaning attaching a dollar value, an economic value to something, truly is subjective. We live in an age of progressivism where Americans sort of assume that morality is subjective. It's not subjective. There's a moral law, there's an objective right and wrong. But here's something that truly is subjective. Economic value.
Right.
How much is that beer stein worth? That really is up to you it might be worth a whole lot, and to someone else it might not be worth anything at all. And that emphasizes the point of pay attention to other people. And what the United States really ushered into the world, and this is, I'm going to wax a little philosophically here for a moment, because this is a moment of moral transformation. And here's what I mean by that. Think of the morality surrounding poverty in all prior history. Throughout all history, I think the general consensus was that we should have pity on and we should sympathize for those who are poor. We should help the poor. It was a sad thing to be poor. According to certain religious teachings, one even finds this in the Christian New Testament, for example, there's something almost virtuous about being poor. Because in the ancient world, who were the wealthy ones? Those who had government power and stole from others. So in the ancient world, there really was something very morally suspicious about being wealthy, and there was something close to noble. I'm not going to say noble, but approaching noble about being poor.
And just to add to that, think about the way you accumulated wealth in those times. You had to be harmful to somebody else.
Right.
It demanded that you harm somebody else in order to not be poor.
Yes, because you were taken. In the end, it was theft. It was theft.
Usually through physical force.
Yes. And what happens as Americans come to discover the idea of property, private property, and then they start to enshrine protection of property into their laws. And this wasn't overnight or instant, right? There was a process here of thinking this through, what this meant, and expanding their laws to protect the property of more and more people. All of a sudden, in a regime of individual liberty and property rights, being poor is not noble.
Right.
And being wealthy is no longer morally suspicious, because when everyone's property is protected and we say, okay, here's the starting point. Everyone has nothing. Think of a kind of state of nature. We all have nothing. How do you get wealthy? How do you create wealth? Well, you produce what others value. You got to be productive. That's not morally suspicious. That is morally laudable. That's
Right.
praiseworthy. We should give entrepreneurs and inventors, right, medals and honors and say, we're happy that you got up off your butt and decided to live and wanted to be productive. And by the way, you helped a whole lot of other people by producing things that they value. And in that sense, there's almost it's like we've turned the morality of poverty upside down. Freedom, that's what freedom does. It says you shouldn't be poor. And
Right.
if you're poor, I mean, there are people in terrible situations who have some terrible disease or some kind of terrible affliction. We should take care of those we care about. But in general, ordinary people, if you want more, produce more. Be more productive. That's the noble thing. And one of the things progressivism does is it has brought back the ancient mode of viewing wealth as morally suspicious.
Right.
In fact, that's kind of the heart of progressivism. Those around you who are successful business people, they are shameful, they are bad, they probably hurt people, they probably lied, cheated, or even used physical force against some. They did something bad, which is why we progressives in government, we need to regulate them and watch them and supervise them to make sure that they don't do any more harm to people. It's amazing to me that this view, the progressive view, is called progressive. It's not progressive. It's quite regressive. It's medieval. It's ancient in the way that it looks at poverty versus wealth. When you understand that an individual can create wealth, that is one of the most liberating, freeing, optimistic ideas. Wow. It means however I was born into the world, I don't have to die that way.
Right.
I can provide something better for my kids. And the path forward is clear. It may not be easy, but it's clear. Produce things that other people want. And then I'm not only helping myself and helping the people I love and care about, I'm becoming a better citizen.
Right.
Because I'm more self-reliant, which means I'm more independent, which means I don't need much from those in the political class. Now I'm in a position to say to them, you do the little job we told you to do.
Right.
Watch around, make sure that no armies and navies come and attack us. And that's it. That's it. Stay back in your little constitutional box.
And the thing that's resulted from all of these regulations and all of these progressive programs has not been the help of the little guy. It has not actually helped who it's intended to help. All it's done is widen the gap between those who have and those who don't, because they've made it harder. They've taken away property rights. They've taken away people's ability to enter the market. They've made it harder for the little guy to enter and compete with the big guy, right? If I have an idea on how to do something better than somebody else is doing it, that's great until the government comes in and regulates it and says, you have to jump all these hurdles before you can ever get into that business.
Yeah.
We've talked about this before, but I've been seeing commercials lately from Facebook advocating for regulating the internet. And
there's an idea.
We've talked about this, and I don't want to dwell on it, but the reason is because they know that the minute that gets regulated, they can afford the lawyers, and they can afford the bureaucrats, and they can afford the cronyism and the payoffs and everything else that goes with that.
The team at Facebook, they'll help write the regulations.
Sure.
And so they're going to write them in such a way that the regulations will be very beneficial to Facebook and put tremendous burdens on any competitors.
Right. And they're going to succeed, and all of their competitors are going to go away. And people think this is about Facebook, Google, Apple, Twitter. Facebook's not trying to protect Twitter. If Mark Zuckerberg's out there requesting regulations, he's going to make it harder on Twitter.
Right.
Too. I mean, this is not about let's just keep these big guys big and the small guys out. It's let's get down to one single operator that does everything, and then we get that monopoly. And all regulations really do in the end is create those large scale monopolies.
That's right.
To the point that government eventually comes in and says, well, now you're a monopoly. We need to make you a public utility, which is what we've been debating since 2016, 2018 about net neutrality. I keep thinking about what the world would look like today with all of these the fights going on about people being censored on social media and the internet. If the internet was a government-run public utility today, there'd be no self-reliance. There'd be no ability to go out and actually create a competitor and do something to say, I have a better idea.
We should never forget that the ultimate monopoly, the only real true monopoly, is government itself, because it's the most awesome, terrifying kind of monopoly. It's a monopoly on legalized force. Force that is enshrined in law, backed up by law and cops and courts and judges and prisons. And so where you find businesses enjoying some kind of monopoly, I promise you, government's closely connected to it. Government helped to create that monopoly for
benefiting from it.
And this reminds me of an important distinction my friend Bert Folsom made in his book, Myth of the Robber Barons. It's a short little book, and I highly recommend it. And what Bert was responding to, the first generation of progressive historians. So I'm talking about the period of 1920s and 1930s, and during the New Deal period, that time frame. The consensus among academic historians were that those high-profile, successful business people in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the Rockefeller,
Carnegie, Vanderbilt,
that whole group, that they were robber barons. They were barons, meaning they were part of a royalty.
Right.
And they were robbers. They were thieves. They got rich by stealing from people, swindling people, lying to people. And Bert Folsom went back and looked at them, and what he discovered is people like Rockefeller. The way Rockefeller became wealthy was by offering better quality products at lower prices,
right,
which benefited millions of people, and it benefited the most poor people.
Right.
People didn't have many resources to begin with. Now all of a sudden, oil for their lamps was less expensive and clean burner and lasted longer, and they loved it. And Bert, in his book, he makes a distinction right at the very beginning between political entrepreneurs and market entrepreneurs, competitive market entrepreneurs. And it kind of, that distinction is important. I want to talk about for a moment here because it muddies this picture we've painted. You know, I said a few minutes ago, in a regime of freedom, real freedom, where the laws actually protect everyone and their property, government stays within the limits of the Constitution, government is not regulating everything, it's not transferring wealth from one group to another. It's just making sure everyone is secure. In a real regime of freedom, there is something praiseworthy, noble about creating wealth, because it means you have to be productive. You got to produce things other people want and need.
Sure.
Wealth creation in a regime of freedom deserves a ribbon or an award. It deserves praise. We want to encourage more of that kind of behavior. In a tyranny, just to draw the contrast, in a tyranny, the wealthy are thugs. They're tyrants. They're thieves. They really are robbers.
Right.
We live in this kind of mixture today. We have some elements of freedom. You can be a competitive market entrepreneur. You can go out and compete against other businesses, other citizens, try to offer a better quality product at a lower price. You can do that, and some people do. And hats off, they deserve kudos. But it's also very easy today because government is so enormous and corrupt and controls so much of our lives to be a political entrepreneur. Political entrepreneurs, they're not inventors. They're not innovators. They get wealthy by trading and offering government favors.
They're not creating wealth. They're just getting wealth. They're taking wealth.
There was a great example in the news here just recently. President Biden announced that the federal government is going to transform its entire fleet of vehicles. I saw the number. It's near 1 million cars and trucks.
Sure.
It's, as you can imagine, right? So the whole federal fleet of cars and trucks, something like 700,000 of them, they're going to switch to American-made electric cars.
Okay.
And just days before that announcement was made, guess what Nancy Pelosi and her husband did? They went and bought it's something like 1 million shares in Tesla.
Right.
Because Tesla makes, American-made electric cars. There's an example of political entrepreneurship. When the federal government signs a contract with Tesla purchase 1 million cars.
Right.
The price of Tesla, the business, is going to go way up. The Pelosi family, they're going to get fabulously wealthy off of that. They didn't create anything.
Right.
They didn't do anything. Their political buddy, Joe Biden, sat with them over drinks one evening and said, hey, this is probably a good time to buy Tesla because the federal government's going to buy a bunch of cars from them.
Well, and let's remember, just for anybody who says, well, there's competition and all of that, Tesla owns stock and vice versa in GM, in Ford, in Chevy. I mean, these car companies all own shares in each other. They all have different electric divisions that are all intertwined with one another. So
I also mentioned just a little bit ago how progressivism has drugged back into our modern world the medieval view of wealth, that there's something noble about being poor and there's something villainous, there's something evil about being wealthy. And here I'm going to offer a little wrinkle in that. Progressivism, it's right in a way, but for the wrong reasons. The wealthy that progressives think are bad, they think competitive market entrepreneurs are bad.
Right.
They're not bad. They're wonderful. We want more of those kinds of people. We want more people inventing new machines, new technologies, new medicines, right? All that. We want that. But there is one group of wealthy people who are shameful, who are an embarrassment, and that is the class of political entrepreneurs. The people who get wealthy by trading, they basically offer for sale government perks, a waiver from a regulation or an exemption or a contract. Here's another example. This happened right in front of our eyes. The whole world saw this. The federal government under the Obama administration was handing out billion-dollar grants, many of them.
Right.
And the country, Ukraine, said, we would like one of those grants. And the federal government, our federal government said, no, we don't really like you, Ukraine. We're not giving you one of those. And they said, well, what if we hire Joe Biden's son? The government owns a state-controlled natural gas company, oil and gas company in Ukraine. We'll hire the son and pay him $100,000 a month. All of a sudden, our federal government said, okay. We'll now give you one of those billion-dollar grants. And they got the grant after hiring Joe Biden's son. And that some of that money ended up, right, it went to the Ukrainian government, which went to that oil and gas company, which went into the Biden family bank account.
Right.
That's an example of political entrepreneurship. It's shameful. It's deeply immoral. And the only solution to it is to get government out of our lives, out of our property, out of our business, have it stop controlling, regulating, and transferring so much wealth.
All that really was a money laundering scheme.
That's right.
I mean, and they do it constantly.
Yes.
They do it constantly. Again, referring back to that Newsweek article from this week that you published. They do the same thing with government employee unions.
Yes.
They take our taxes and then they give them to the government employee unions who give them back to the campaigns, and those campaigns end up. Who did I just hear? Maxine Waters. Her daughter made something like $2.6 million on her last election. Yep. That her daughter was doing something with email marketing or something for the campaign and was paid $2.6 million.
And trace that back.
Right.
The money that was paid to the daughter, Maxine Waters' daughter, that was campaign money.
Right.
I promise you, a whole lot of that campaign money came from government employee unions. Well, where did those unions get money? They took it from the government employees. Where did the government employees get the money? They got paid a salary with tax dollars. Right. Well, who got the tax dollars? Maxine Waters, right, votes to tax citizens and take their money, and it ends right up in her campaign and in her daughter's bank account.
And we've seen plenty of times those occasions where at the end of the year, come December, they get this big bonus. The union has some extra money left over in their coffers, right, and they say, here's a nice bonus. We would really like it if you gave all that money, all that bonus or half that bonus to this campaign so we can keep making sure you get bonuses in the future.
Yeah, that's right.
And the whole sum of all of this is they're not creating wealth. And so I want to go back to the chart you were talking about. You have this chart, it starts, it's really small, and then it's skyrocketed. And there's all this wealth out there. Now there's a lot of wealth out there, but there's also a lot of debt out there. So I'm not quite sure how high that really is today, or if we would have plateaued at, say, some point in the 1860s, 1900.
Right.
Would we have plateaued, or is the debt and the progressive investment continuing to make that climb? But either way, at one point, most of these politicians, the political class, does not want people to be self-reliant. They want all of the money going into their pockets. They want to control it. They don't want anybody to create more wealth because they don't need it. If they have all of the wealth, they can start demanding things. They control supply and demand curves, and therefore they control pricing. They start legislating and regulating pricing. They start regulating and legislating how much of a product is being made so that they can control everything. And they end up in one way or another getting all of the money into their pockets.
Dave,
and we go right back to where that king model from before.
You're saying something really radical, and I like it. What you're saying is that being productive, creating wealth, being self-reliant, it's not only good for the individual. It is good for the individual. And we have a civic duty. We have a civic duty to be self-reliant, to be independent, precisely because self-reliant, independent citizens are not easily pushed around by those in government, by the political class. And the political class wants people who are easy to push around, easy to boss around. And the best way to do that is to have large numbers of people dependent on those in government. Then it's really easy to boss them around and control their lives.
You don't need whips. You don't need chains. All you need is to say, you're not going to eat tomorrow if you don't do what I say.
You're not going to get that check. You want the check? You do what we tell you to do. And that's why this final virtue of self-reliance, being self-reliant, independent, it's intrinsic to all the other virtues. It's hard to be self-assertive and self-restrained and to have civic knowledge and to exercise that knowledge if we're not productive and self-reliant and independent. So in a way, it's kind of the crown jewel. It ties all the other civic virtues together, helping us get a clear picture of what it looks like to be a virtuous citizen.
And when you are that virtuous citizen, and when you do exercise those virtues that we've seen in the last 240 years, 245 years, you can see the enormous growth that society takes, the improvement in quality of life that our society has gone through over all of that time. And you think through this whole conversation we just had, and it's so clear that there is an attempt to stifle that. There's an attempt to end that growth. And how scary and how sad that is, because we are moving such a great speed of growth and innovation and improvements on quality of life. And there's so much more room to grow and so much more room to improve. And now that's being stopped in the interest of a few political kings who just want to say, no, give me my power, and that's more important than the welfare of society.
Political royalists, absolutely. So it really comes down to this. This is the mission. This is the purpose of the Vino Veritas Society. Our goal is to, I'm gonna quote our former president. It is to transform America, transform it from what it is right now, and to have much less progressive central planning, progressive government control, progressive government dependency. Have less of all of that, and to have more citizens, growing numbers of citizens who are self-restrained, who are self-assertive, who understand their rights and duties and the purpose of their government, and who are self-reliant and independent. That's our purpose of the Vino Veritas Society.
And for those who want to do that, they should become guardians.
That's right.
That's exactly what Juvenal was talking about when he asked who will guard us from the guardians.
That's right.
He knew that those people, that those in political power were going to abuse us. Right. Eventually they were going to abuse us, and somebody had to be the guardians against those people. The guardians against the guardians.
Who's going to protect us from the protectors? Who's going to guard us from the guardians?
And for those who are new to our podcast, to those who are new to our organization, that is why we say nos sumus custodes. That's why we say we are the guardians.
We are the guardians.
Until next week, we'll pick it up again.